Black Lives Matter protests continued throughout the weekend, and protesters have a new demand: defund the police and start spreading the news. New York City reopening for business starting today. Here's what you need to know. Good morning. This is Cheddar's Need2Know podcast for Monday, June 8th. I am Jill Wagner with Carlo Versano. Hey, Carlo. Good morning.
How was your weekend, Jill?
It was okay. It was really busy. Are you in New York City right now? Or are you back in Brooklyn?
I am back in the old apartment.
Reopening today.
It is. Yeah. It's also summer, evidently. There's always that like one weekend where it goes from spring to summer. That was definitely this weekend. It's now just hot, humid, and gross for like the next 3 months here.
Yep. We had about 2 weeks of nice spring weather.
It's always what happens, right?
All right, let's get to the news. For a second weekend, tens of thousands of people poured into cities across the country to protest against racial injustice and specifically the police. From Philadelphia to Portland to D.C. to Boise, Idaho, rallies were largely peaceful, even as many protesters defied curfews to remain on the streets. Overseas, marches in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement were held in Sydney, Rome, Hong Kong, and Madrid, among others. And the British city of Bristol, people pulled down a statue of a former slave trader and pushed it into the river.
Some incredible video. Did you see that yesterday?
Yeah.
Of them. Jill, I went to check out the big protest here in Brooklyn on Saturday with my mask on. My wife and I had our masks on. This was by far our biggest crowd event, probably in, God, I don't even know how long. Years.
It's shocking, right? If you haven't seen people in a while, to just go and everyone's like, "Oh wait, everyone's out."
It's very surreal, truly, and a little bit like weird. You're like, well, I hope that I hope we're right about the masks being this big help. But I think the takeaway that I saw from being out on Saturday was, first of all, the idea that this movement is being led by like Antifa or whatever is ridiculous. I mean, you're talking about everybody there was wearing masks, literally everybody, with the exception of a big chunk of the police force. There were kids there, old people, young people, babies and strollers, white people, black people. It was really remarkable. And what's also been remarkable to me about this protest movement is the endurance of it. It's not uncommon in this country to see really big protests, right? We've talked about these before. The Women's March, for instance. And it's also not uncommon to see protests that really last for like a long time, like the Occupy movement from a few years back. But it's very rare to see organic protests on this scale that last for this long in this country. I think that's sort of the takeaway here. It's just remarkable, at least not ever, but at least in our lifetimes.
Yeah, well, one of the questions surrounding this protest had been, what do protesters want specifically?
Right.
Besides, just being out there to fight against police brutality against African Americans, it's what are the specifics? And we are getting specifics. The protest movement has now been coalescing around the rallying cry, defund the police. So the general idea here is that America's police departments have long received too much money from taxpayers, which have allowed them to militarize to an extent that threatens the public for whom they serve. In New York City, Mayor de Blasio pledging for the first time to cut the NYPD's budget. In Los Angeles, the mayor said that he is tossing out his plans for an increase into the LAPD's budget. In Minneapolis, which is the site of the George Floyd killing, the mayor there was booed out of a rally when he said he would not commit to defunding the police department. Later, the Minneapolis City Council said it had a veto-proof majority to not defund the police department, but to dismantle the police department as it currently exists and then replace it with an entirely new public safety system. This is what we're going to be seeing. This is the debate, the political debate that we're going to be seeing, I think, for the next few months at least.
Oh no, absolutely. The Minneapolis news particularly fascinating because I mean, the speed at which they did that is remarkable. I guess we'll see what it actually means. Um, there's an interesting argument, right, about the term defund the police, right? Because it's true what you said about how it's sort of like the rallying cry. You see it, that was sort of that was the chant at these protests that I saw on Saturday. It was a lot of the signs had that written on them. And there's sort of an interesting argument, right? Because when you say it, the meaning that people get from it is, you want to abolish the police as like a whole, right? Get rid of them entirely. And obviously, the vast majority of people in this country, I don't think, would support that. The actual movement is probably something more closer to like reform the police, right? But of course, that doesn't really have the power, I think, in terms of like the words, right? Um, and I think a lot of people would support that. I think the majority of Americans would support major changes to the police departments in this country. But the question is, right, if you say, defund the police, are you turning off those potential supporters with a message that's out of the mainstream? I don't know. I mean, this kind of happened with Occupy Wall Street, if you remember, and it kind of just fizzled out because they couldn't really settle on a message.
This is what Donald Trump is counting on, at least if you look at his tweets.
Oh, yeah.
He is already trying to tie the policy of defunding the police to Democrats, specifically to Joe Biden. So keeping up with the 2020 election, a couple of bad signs for the president. He is now down significantly in most polls when it's just against Joe Biden. And a small but growing number of establishment Republicans are saying that they are not going to vote for him. Colin Powell, George W. Bush, and Mitt Romney have all indicated they're not going to support the president of their party in November. And Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska says that she is struggling with the decision. She said she applauded James Mattis for coming out and expressing concern.
Yeah, and that's interesting, obviously, because she's sort of one of these centrist Republicans. He can't really afford to lose too many of them. The flip side of that is, George W. Bush, Mitt Romney, Colin Powell, none of them really supported Donald Trump the first time around, I don't think. Although it's obviously
Colin Powell had endorsed Hillary Clinton, and he had endorsed Barack Obama, actually. So he hasn't really endorsed Republicans for a while now.
Right. Look, I think it's not a good sign if you're the president and there's respected members of your party saying they're going to vote for the other guy. That's clearly not good. And it is a sign that he's starting to lose some of that Republican support. But I think that's probably insignificant. There's literally not a single Trump supporter, Trump voter who cares that Mitt Romney isn't going to vote for him, right? Like it doesn't have like an actual meaning in terms of his coalition.
Yeah, and the president just that his Twitter feed, he basically then started calling Colin Powell overrated and calling him a stiff. I'm back to Colin Powell, but just the name calling is just so juvenile.
Well, apparently the White just briefly, I read this morning that the White House is now they see the writing on the wall, right? They see that he's in trouble. So they're trying to put together some sort of like big speech this week on unity and racism. So I guess we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, I mean, I want to get to we have so much other news, but just remind me of that, because we did hear from the president on Friday. Okay. It is a new day, Carlo, in New York City. Almost 3 months since the city shut down, the original epicenter of the United States and the original epicenter of the U.S. coronavirus outbreak. We think we're the epicenter of the United States, but everyone else would probably disagree. But we were the epicenter of the coronavirus outbreak. We are now entering the first phase of reopening, effective today. So manufacturing, construction, and retail will be allowed to reopen across the city. There are some restrictions in place, though. New COVID-19 infections in New York City down to 500 or so a day. That's about half the amount from a month ago. Almost 22,000 New Yorkers have died in the exactly 100 days since the city reported its first case. 22,000 New Yorkers. That is a pretty incredible number, but still good news right now. The city at least starting to reopen.
Yeah, and they pulled the curfew the other day. They pulled the curfew yesterday, so there's finally some sense of normalcy. At least we're hoping we're getting to a sense of normalcy here in New York. But the thing that I found also notable, Jill, is Cuomo said, the governor of New York yesterday, he gave the go-ahead for open-air graduations across the state. And I really hope that means high schools in New York, at least, are going to be able to get it together to graduate their seniors this month. Because, you and I have talked about this a lot, right? Like just how disruptive this has been to college students, but specifically to high school students and to kids. And I really don't see any reason at this point why you wouldn't be able to hold a big graduation ceremony outside on like the football field, which is where we had ours. You spread the chairs out, have the parents spread out in the bleachers, like let these kids put their cap and gowns on and get applauded. For a lot of people, that is graduating high school is a significant life event. And I think that teenagers really should not be robbed of that if we can do it safely, I should say. But schools are going to have to take a little bit of a risk here. But I'll be interested to see if they can pull it together, because this is, June 8th. So at least in the Northeast, high schools graduate in the next 2 weeks or so. Is that how you were?
Yeah, about there.
So we'll see, but that's my hope. I really hope that we see some graduations.
I would agree with you there. Carlo, we did not get a chance to talk about that jobs report, which came out on Friday after we'd wrapped up our show. It was shocking.
Yeah.
Showing that 2.5 million jobs were added in the month of May. The expectations across the board were that about 8 million jobs would be lost. So let's just think about that. We were expecting 8 million jobs lost and 2.5 million jobs were gained. And the unemployment rate fell from 14.7 to 13.3%. The government later said that the unemployment rate should have actually been 16.3%, and that there was a misclassification error with the data. But still, the headline here is that, we were thinking, 20% unemployment,
Yep.
8 million jobs lost. And in fact, 2.5 million jobs gained is the biggest month of gains ever in the history of this country.
Jill, I mean,
of course, it's all relative, but.
Of course, right. But I think, you and I were on the air when this, or you were on the air when this was coming down, but we were shocked. I mean, I couldn't even believe it. I think it's probably too early to tell what it means. I think you really need to see a few months of these reports to get a sense of how representative they are. But, maybe I'm wrong in my pessimism, that this recovery is going to be long. I hope that I am. I still think I still have a hard time believing that this is going to be this V-shape recovery. But also an interesting point in the data, dentists were responsible for 10% of the gains. Dentists, it's the dentist-led recovery.
I didn't dig in deep to that number, but I agree. I mean, I think that the jury is still out on the jobs picture. And I think, okay, first of all, I do wonder, because we rely so much on these surveys of economists for just kind of a gauge of where things are. How were they so wrong? I just wonder in terms of the predictions, how it was so off. But no,
I don't know the answer to that.
I think that, also, I mean, we're talking still 1 in 4 Americans pretty much. Maybe if it's a little bit less than that, it's still a lot of people who had a job in the beginning of March and currently don't. So I think it could have been dire, and it certainly wasn't that in terms of the jobs report, but I don't think we're certainly not out of the woods here. And Carlo, since you were talking about graduations just now, YouTube held its big virtual commencement events last night. There were tons of cameos: Barack and Michelle Obama, BTS, Katy Perry, Beyonce, Mariah Carey.
Yeah, I hadn't seen this. Although I did link to the one thing that I did see in the newsletter this morning, which is this big cover that they did of "Beautiful Day," that U2 song. Remember that song? Good song.
Love that song.
Um, Look, this is cool for sure. But again, if I were an 18-year-old, I'd rather be sitting out in the hot field, hungover in my polyester gown, listening to the most annoying person in my class deliver the valedictorian speech than I don't think that you can replicate those kind of life events with these sort of like virtual commencement things. But that doesn't mean it's not really cool that people are doing it.
All right, Carlo, let's end on some good news. What do you have?
I was thinking about my good news on Saturday when I was out, experiencing these protests, and my good news, I guess, is just seeing all the older folks who were out there protesting this weekend. One woman had a sign, and this almost like made me cry. All mothers, her sign said, quote, "All mothers were summoned when George Floyd called out for his mama." It was really powerful, and not just in New York, in Palm Beach, a single 80-year-old woman came out to a protest there. There's some amazing pictures of just her by herself on the side of the street. And I think the other thing is, irrespective of what you think about the specifics, right, of defund the police or like what this actual movement is about, the larger point of the unrest that we're seeing, from the pandemic to the police departments, right, to the White House protests, I really feel like people have this sense that the social contract in this country has really been broken, and the people in power have not held up their end of the bargain. And I think that's sort of the thing that ties all of this sense of unrest together. There's this new poll out this morning from NBC and the Wall Street Journal. 80% of people in this country think that the country is spiraling out of control, which is amazing. But anyway, I'm going off on a tangent. But my good news, I guess, is just to see the response get activated. I think in the streets is just a really good thing, and to see people out there, exercising their constitutional rights. And the police were totally like, at least where I was, I didn't see any really confrontations at all. So that was my good news.
Yeah, I saw an Auschwitz survivor. I'm not sure which city it was, but was out showing her number and saying, showing her support for the protests as well.
Yeah.
Really powerful. My good news right now, New Zealand, entirely COVID-19 free, which means that nobody in that country is currently battling the virus. New Zealand is lifting all restrictions that were in place except for really stringent border controls. The Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, your fave, says that she did a little dance when she heard that there were no cases left, and she's still getting a ton of praise for how the country handled the pandemic, which she shut New Zealand down entirely for 4 weeks and then gradually started a reopening. So
well, we should have
kudos to New Zealand.
Can we have her? Is that possible? We just take her?
New Zealanders might be complaining about that. One other thing I want to mention, and it's not really a quick thing, but a huge thank you to everybody who wrote in to us, really thoughtful about the idea of cancel culture, which we talked about on Friday. Whether you agree with us or disagree, just a super, super important conversation to be having. Appreciate everyone's insights on that Tom Cotton op-ed from the New York Times. One quick note, James Bennett, the editor of the New York Times editorial page, resigned after approving that op-ed. And also over the weekend, Stan Wisniewski, and I apologize if I mispronounced it, who's the top editor at the Philadelphia Inquirer, he resigned over a story that they ran with the headlines, "Buildings Matter Too." So those are really big developments just in the world of media.
Yeah, I think I actually read that Philadelphia Inquirer story, and it was the story itself was like not that inflammatory at all. It was probably a stupid headline. But I mean, the one thing I'll say about the guy who at the Times who was resigning, he said that he didn't read that op-ed before it was published. So, I mean, I guess to the extent that it's a fireable offense, it's probably not so much that he published it, but if you're going to have like an op-ed from a sitting senator about like a really impassioned issue and you don't read it first, I don't know. That's really not a good look. But yeah, I mean, thank you everyone for emailing. Really good thoughts. It's just fascinating to hear, what other people, what like regular people think. Not that we're not regular, but you know how it is.
Well, Carlo, I'm glad that you mentioned the editor not reading that op-ed, because apparently there were also a lot of factual errors in it as well, which is another reason that perhaps he felt like he had to resign. Ben Smith of the New York Times, who's their media columnist, he wrote, I just want to end on this, which I think sums up kind of where we are. He says, now as America is wrestling with the surging of a moment that began in August of 2014, its biggest newsrooms are trying to find common ground between a tradition that aims to persuade the widest possible audience that its reporting is neutral, and journalists who believe that fairness on issues from race to Donald Trump requires clear moral calls. This is something newsrooms are going to be wrestling with, I think, for a while.
Absolutely, Jill. And it'd be a fascinating time to be in college studying this stuff. Is all I can think, as sort of like a media nerd, because there's definitely a change happening. But yeah.
All right, we got to leave it there. Hope everyone had a really great weekend. That's what you need to know for Monday, June 8th.
See you tomorrow, guys.